focusing our time today. I'm not going to ask you to stand today as we read, but I would ask you that as we do read this text, if you would focus and attend to it as you follow along. Also, on the back of your bulletin, there's an outline of today's message. If you'd like to use that to kind of guide your thoughts as we go through, feel free to follow along and take notes if you want to do that. I know sometimes people learn and retain information differently. Some people learn best auditorially, just by hearing and listening. Some learn best visually by seeing charts and diagrams and things like that. And some learn best by being able to write things down. I am definitely someone who retains information much better once I write it down. A few weeks ago when Jess and I were doing some organizing, I came across just notebook after notebook of sermon notes from my time down in Maryland and up in Eden. So I'm definitely someone who learns best by writing things down. If that's you, feel free to do that today, but however you prefer, however you learn best, let's try to go to the Lord and keep our hearts in focus on Him. We're going to be starting in verse 20 today and reading down to the end of the chapter in verse 27. Starting in verse 20 of Proverbs chapter 4. My son, attend to my words. Incline thine ear to my sayings. Let them not depart from thine eyes. Keep them in the midst of thine heart. For they are life unto those that find them, and health to all their flesh. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Put away from thee a froward mouth, and perverse lips put far from thee. Let thine eyes look right on, and let thine eyelids look straight before thee. Ponder the path of thy feet, and let all thy ways be established. Turn not to the right hand or to the left. Remove thy foot from evil. Let's pray together. Our Heavenly Father, once again, we are just so thankful to meet with you today.
Yes. Amen.
As we do, Lord, I ask you to remove any distractions,
Yes.
any hindrances that would keep us from hearing your voice today. Father, we believe that you have a message that you want us to hear.
Yes.
We believe that you want to speak to us today. And as you do speak to us, Lord, help us to respond like Samuel. When he heard you calling him, respond and said, Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. Help us, Lord, to quiet our hearts, focus our minds on your voice today.
Yes.
As always, Lord, nobody needs to hear from me, but we all need to hear from you.
Yes. Amen.
Holy Spirit, I ask you to have free reign among us today. Challenge us, change us, help us to become more conformed to the image of our Savior today.
Yes.
We pray all of these things in the perfect, precious, and powerful name of Jesus.
Yes.
Everybody said,
Amen.
Last week we began a series entitled Steps to a Better Spirit. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 20, Paul wrote and gave the direction to glorify God in your body and in your spirit. As Christians, as believers, it's not enough for us to glorify God with our body. We also have to glorify God with our spirit. It's not enough for us to glorify God with the actions that we perform. We must also glorify God with our attitudes and our motivations. In order to do that, often that requires us to change. Now, change is not something that comes easily or naturally for most of us. Even once we get saved, we have our own thoughts, we have our own attitudes, our own inclinations. But if they're not right with God, those thoughts, those motivations, those attitudes need to change. Last week we saw why it's so important for us to take steps towards a better spirit. We saw that our spirit is an indication of our proximity to God. In the book of Matthew, Jesus said it's possible for us to draw nigh to God with our mouth and to honor him with our lips, but yet our hearts still be very far from him.
Yes. Amen.
If our spirit isn't right, we won't be close to God. And if our spirit isn't right, we can't be close to God. We also saw that we've been procured, we've been obtained by God. We saw that we've been purchased by God, and we've been possessed by God. If you remember, it says we've been bought with a price.
Amen.
Purchased by God. You are not your own. Glorify God in your body, in your spirit, which are God's. God bought you. And since he bought you, you exist wholly and completely for the sole purpose of exalting him, praising and glorifying the one who now owns you. And as we move on to today's message, we're reminded that as we refer to Spirit during this series, we're not referring to the person of the Holy Spirit. We're talking about how Barnes Bible Commentary refers to it as our attitudes, our inclinations, our moods, or our frame of mind. In this sense, we're referring to the Spirit as being synonymous with our heart or our mind. We're going to go through this series in different sections. And the first section that we're going to begin with today starts with a focus on the heart. And today's message is entitled, It's a Matter of Heart and Why the Heart Matters. And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to examine Scripture that not only indicates how our heart is so inseparable from our spirit, but also things that we can do to improve the condition of our heart, to take steps towards a better spirit. Because as we talked about last week, there's no mistake about it. If your heart's not right, your spirit's not going to be right.
Amen.
And you can't glorify God with your spirit unless your heart is right with God. As we look into our text, the first thought I'd like us to see is a personal appeal. In verse 20, it begins with two words, but they're very powerful words. Verse 20 begins with these words and it says, my son. Say that with me. My son. Now, to understand why these words are so strong and so persuasive, we need to understand who is speaking them. If you turn back to the beginning of Proverbs, chapter 1, verse 1, we see who the author is right from the very beginning. It says, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. So the author of this text that we just read is the most wealthy, most wise, most powerful king in the world. How wealthy was he? The gold that he received as a tribute from other nations that were subject to him were estimated to have been $40 billion a year. Some scholars came to the conclusion that King Solomon's entire fortune was somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.2 trillion. And I don't even know how many zeros are in $2.2 trillion. But in American dollars, 1 trillion is 1,000 times 1 billion. So whatever that number is, multiply that by 2.2, and you got Solomon. So yeah, Solomon had a little bit. He had a pretty good nest egg. His rainy day fund was pretty secure. But Solomon wasn't just a wealthy man, he was also a very wise man. In 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 29, it says that God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding exceeding much. This was a man, if you remember back from our Sunday evening Bible study a couple months ago, who was at the cutting edge, the very forefront of technology when it came to horticulture and agriculture and water systems. You name it, anything you could think of at that time, Solomon had wisdom in it. But notice in verse 20, Solomon doesn't make his appeal based on his status as being the wealthiest king in the world. He doesn't make his appeal based on his status as being the wisest, most influential person in the world. He makes his appeal in the most loving, most caring, and most passionate way possible, through a personal appeal. He says, look, I'm not speaking to you as a financial expert. I'm not speaking to you as an astute thinker. I'm not speaking to you as a military genius or an educated person or a prudent king. He says, I'm speaking to you as a father to my son. And let me just say this really quickly. It's not the focus of our message, so we're not going to dwell on this. But as a parent, you have the ability to have the most profound impact possible on your children's lives.
Yeah, that's right. Amen.
Don't ever think for 1 second that there's no reason for them to listen to you, or to think that you have nothing to offer your kids. The tendency to think, well, I'm not that rich, I'm not that educated by the world's standards. That doesn't matter. There are lots of wealthy people in the world. There are lots of smart people in the world. But they're not the ones who should be shaping your children's minds.
That's right. Amen.
There's only two people in the entire world who can honestly say these two words: my son, my daughter, my child. Those are words that can only be uttered by a mother or a father. Now, there are lots of athletes that make millions of dollars. That doesn't mean that they're who your kid should be looking to guide their decisions. There are lots of scholars and politicians that might have more education or more natural intellect, but that doesn't mean they should be the ones shaping your child's thought patterns. We see here in our text, when it came to a matter of the heart, it wasn't made by a financial appeal. It wasn't an educational appeal. It started first with a personal appeal. And next we see the primary aim. Verse 20 continues and says, attend to my words. So here we see the author, King Solomon, he says, look, I love you. You're my son. I want what's best for you. Back in verse 1, Solomon says, hear ye children the instruction of a father, and attend to know understanding. For I give you good doctrine. The things that I want to teach you, the things I want you to learn, he says, these are for your own good. But in order to get the benefit, you can't just hear my words. You must attend to them. You've got to pay attention to them. You've got to apply these words to your life. And he gives the steps on how to do that. As we see next, the practical actions. At the end of verse 20, it says, incline thine ear unto my sayings. Verse 21 says, let them not depart from thine eyes. Keep them in the midst of thy heart. When we read at the end of verse 20 where it says, incline thine ear unto my sayings, that doesn't just mean listen to me. In fact, there's a big difference between listening to someone and inclining your ear to someone. To incline your ear literally means to lean or bend and get as close as you can to the speaker. It's a response that requires not only our ears, but it's a response that requires our heart. If I were talking to Philip here on the front row, and we're having a casual conversation, as he's speaking, I could kind of nod my head to give some indication that I comprehend what he's saying. But if I really want to hear him, what's our natural inclination? If somebody's speaking, we really want to hear him. What do? We lean in. We incline our ears to get closer, to make sure that we can hear it as best as we can. And when we do that, it gives the indication that not only is the speaker important, but what they're saying to us matters to us as well. In a personal sense, as we think about having our heart right with God, which is kind of the focus of this series, I want you to ask yourself first by thinking, are you listening to God? Or are you actually inclining your ears to God? Are you trying to hear from God? Or are you putting yourself in a position to get as close as you possibly can to Him so you can hear His words more clearly? If you're listening to God and making some attempt to hear from Him, that's a good start. But if you're attempting to hear from God without making any changes or any effort to get closer to Him, you're not inclining your ears to God. But if I can have Dan come forward real quick. Dan, you can come up here. Now, Dan can come up here. We can stand here in the front row. Down here. And if he's talking, we can be kind of casual. We can talk to each other. We can probably hear each other from this distance. But if he's saying something that really matters, so and let's just admit first, it's okay to admit this, we live busy lives. This is not a life, we don't live lives that's very easy to just block out all the distractions all the time. We live, and God tells us He speaks to us in a still, small voice.
Yes.
So if Dan's speaking to me, and there's a lot of noise going on, as there is in all of our lives, a lot of distractions, and he starts speaking, I really want to hear from him, what am I going to do? We thought I'm going to lean in. But watch what happens. As I lean closer with my ear, you know what happens? My heart gets closer to Him as well. When we incline to God, when we bend our ears to hear from God, we put our hearts in a position to draw closer to God. And what does James 4:8 say? Draw nigh to me, and I'll draw nigh to you.
Yes.
And we can't draw nigh to God until we start first with inclining our ears and having our hearts follow it. Thank you. So one of the first steps of getting our hearts right with God is inclining our ears to God. And then in verse 21, it says this, let them not depart from thine eyes, keep them in the midst of thy heart. So here we see that in order to get our hearts right with God, it can't be just a one-time turning to God. It can't be an occasional focus on God. This can't be a temporary or sporadic concentration on God. In order to get our hearts right and keep our hearts right, it requires a consistent, persistent dedication. Verse 21 says, let them not depart from thine eyes. In Matthew chapter 14, we see maybe the most straightforward illustration related to keeping our eyes focused. If you remember that chapter, it says that the disciples were on a ship and a terrible storm arose. And Jesus came to them walking on the water. If you remember the story, it says that Peter called out and said, Lord, bid me come to thee on the water. And Jesus said, come, and he beckoned them out of the ship. And for a moment, Peter walked on the water. Verse 29, it says that Peter came down out of the ship, and he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But then in verse 30, it says that when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid and began to sink. Why? Because he took his eyes off Jesus.
Yep, that's right.
Now, Philip and Sabrina just sang just a little bit ago, turn your eyes upon Jesus. And he goes on and says, look full in his wonderful face. When we turn our eyes on Jesus, keep them there. Don't turn away. And if our hearts need to be changed, if our hearts need to be right with God, if we want to get our hearts right with God, we need to keep our eyes fixated and focused on God.
Amen.
So verse 20 says that we need to incline our ears. Verse 21 tells us to focus our eyes. And at the end of verse 21, it says, keep them in the midst of thine heart. Now that word keep means to maintain, to preserve them, to retain them, to keep them is to be steadfast. Solomon says, these words that I'm sharing with you, these thoughts that I'm attempting to impart some spiritual wisdom through, you've got to attend to them, but you've got to focus on them with all of your abilities, with your ears, with your eyes. You've got to incline your ear. You've got to fixate your eyes. You have to preserve them in your heart in order for your heart to get right or stay right with God. So we see the personal appeal, the primary aim, and the practical actions. Next we see the pivotal advice. Verse 23 begins and says, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. So we see here the answer to the question of the sermon today. Matters of the heart and why the heart matters. We see here very clearly why the condition of our heart matters. It tells us here that the condition of our heart matters because everything in our life is connected and affected by our heart. And since this is the case, since this is true, we are told to keep our heart with all diligence. Now, what does that mean to keep your heart? Well, we know what that means. It means that when given the option to give something away or to hold on to it, we choose to keep it. You say, well, why does that matter? Because a lot of people are giving their hearts away. A lot of young people are giving their hearts to boyfriends or girlfriends instead of keeping their heart. A lot of adults are giving their hearts to their jobs. People give their efforts and their ambitions to their sports teams. People give their hearts to people or things that do not cause them to be drawn closer to God. If I could just give a little bit of advice here to those that are maybe younger, those who aren't married, don't give your heart away. Don't give your heart away to a guy or girl that does not share your love or devotion to Jesus Christ.
Amen. Amen.
Don't give your heart to a job. Don't give your time and energy and talent to endeavors that aren't going to matter in eternity. Colossians chapter 3, verse 2 says, set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. D.L. Moody said, our greatest fear should not be a failure, but at succeeding in something that doesn't matter. When we talk about keeping our heart, it's not only related to holding on to it, to maintain possession of it, but also means to protect our heart. And how do we do that? Very simply by being very aware and attentive of what we're allowing into our heart. We have three enemies that are outlined for us in the Bible that we must protect our heart from: the world, the flesh, and the
Amen.
devil.
Yes.
And the day in which we live requires us to be maybe more diligent to prepare our hearts, or to protect our hearts, than any other time in history. When you think about the internet, with literally anything imaginable at our fingertips, from gambling, to pornography, to violence of all kinds, to the ease at which alcohol and drugs can be purchased. Any devices that you can think of, they're more readily available and more easily accessible today than they were in times past. And with so much sin, with so much temptation surrounding us, we need to protect our hearts. We also need to preserve our hearts. Michael Hyatt, in one of his articles related to the heart, gives 3 reasons why we must guard our heart. And the first thing he gives is because our heart is extremely valuable. He gives this illustration. We don't guard worthless things. I take my garbage to the street every Wednesday night. It's picked up on Thursday morning. It sits on the sidewalk all night, completely unguarded. Why? Because it's worthless. Not so with your heart. It is the essence of who you are. It is your authentic self, the core of your being. It is where all your dreams, your desires, and your passions live. It is that part of you that connects with God and other people. Just like with your physical body, if your heart, your spiritual heart dies, part of you dies with it. This is why Solomon says, above all else, he doesn't say if you get around to it, or it would be nice if he says, make this a top priority. So one reason why we need to preserve our heart is because it's extremely valuable. But secondly, because our hearts are under constant attack. When Solomon says to guard our heart, he implies that we are living in a combat zone, one in which there are very real casualties. In 1 Peter 5:8, it tells us that we have an adversary, the devil, who walks around as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may not just play with, not have fun with for a little while, and then turn back over to the Lord, seeking whom he may devour. And many people are very oblivious to the reality of this war. We have an enemy who is determined, bent on our destruction. And he's an enemy who not only opposes God, he opposes everything that God's opposed, everything that God is for, including us. Anything that is aligned with God, he's against.
Yes.
So we see the importance of protecting and preserving our hearts. Then the question is, how can we do this? How can we protect our heart? How can I preserve my heart? By preparing our hearts. In 2 Chronicles chapter 12, it tells us about a king named Rehoboam. And in verse 14, it says that he did evil because he prepared not his heart to seek the Lord. Now, if you think about it, nobody wakes up one morning and says, you know what, I feel like being a jerk today. I'm going to go downstairs, I'm going to start an argument with my wife. I'm going to argue with my kids. On the way to work, I'm going to honk at people. And then when I get there, I'm going to argue with my colleagues and start a fight with my boss. That sounds like a good plan for the day. Nobody wakes up with that intention.
Right.
No one would say, I'm going to see if I can go out of my way to fall into sin today. Let me see if I can pick up an addiction that's going to drive me away from God. Let me see if I can get involved in a relationship that's going to keep my heart far from God. Nobody's going to do that, but how do we fall into that? Because we don't prepare our hearts.
Yep. Amen. That's right.
We don't take time to prepare our hearts. It says Rehoboam did evil, not because he decided it, he just woke up and decided he wanted to be wicked. Not because he made the conscious decision to disobey God. It says he did evil because he didn't prepare his heart to seek the Lord. And if you're here today, maybe you've gotten involved in some area of sin, some relationship maybe that you never intended to. Maybe you're far away from God. Maybe your heart isn't right with God right now, simply because you haven't been preparing your heart to seek God. If you want to get our hearts right with God, keep our hearts right with God, we have to be constantly committed to protecting, preserving, and preparing our heart. So we see the pivotal advice to keep our heart, and next we see the powerful assertion at the end of verse 23, where it says, for out of it are the issues of life. Your heart is the source of everything that you do.
Yes. Amen.
It's the source of everything else in your life. What is in your heart overflows into your thoughts, it overflows into your words, and it overflows into your actions. The same author that I mentioned earlier, Michael Hyatt, gave this illustration. He said, in Tennessee, where I live, we have thousands and thousands of natural springs where water flows to the surface of the earth from deep under the ground. It then accumulates in pools or runs off into creeks and streams. If you plug up a stream, you stop the flow of water. If you poison the water, the flow becomes toxic. In either situation, you threaten life downstream. Everything depends on the condition of the stream. So spiritually speaking, if your heart is unhealthy, it's going to impact everything else.
Amen.
If your heart is unhealthy, it's going to impact your relationship with your family. If your heart's not right, it's going to impact your relationship with your coworkers. If your heart's not right, it's going to impact your relationship with God. Your heart affects everything. When we think about the effect that our heart has, the wide-reaching effect on us, one commentary I read put it this way. It says, the heart commonly refers to the center of thinking and reason, but it also includes the emotions, the will, and thus the entire inner being. The heart is the heart is the depository of all wisdom and the source of whatever affects your speech, sight, and conduct. So if we just think about those three things, how does your heart affect your speech? Well, first and foremost, we see in Ephesians chapter 4:29 what God tells us about our speech. It says, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. That's the standard that we're given. Matthew chapter 12, verse 34 says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So if I'm prone to flying off the handle, or if you're prone to saying things you shouldn't, if you're prone to arguing with people, criticizing people, being contentious, it's not just an issue with your mouth, it's a problem with your heart.
Yes, amen. Amen.
That doesn't just indicate a tongue problem, it indicates a heart problem. Matthew chapter 11, verse 18 says that the things which proceed out of the mouth come forth of the heart, and they defile the man. Now, have you ever thought about that? That whatever is in your heart, whatever's in your heart right now, is either defiling you or purifying you. Whatever is in your heart either corrupts you or cleanses you. There is no middle ground.
That's right. Amen.
Whatever is in your heart either violates you or elevates you, spiritually speaking. So how do we take steps towards a better spirit? What can we do to get our hearts right with God? Well, next we see proficient applications. After Solomon calls our attention to the effect that our heart has on everything else in our lives, after giving the instruction to keep our hearts with all diligence, we're now given the blueprint or the plan on how to do that. If we want to protect our heart, if we want to preserve our heart, if we want to keep it, to restore it to being in the right condition with God, verse 24 says, put away from thee a froward mouth, and perverse lips put far from thee. Very simply, in order to get your heart right with God, and keep your heart right with God, you might have to change the way you speak. You might have to change the way you talk. Now the word froward is related to being ornery. Someone who is contrary, headstrong, someone who is stubborn and insubmissive. Solomon says, once again, look, you're my son. I love you. I want what's best for you. And if you want to keep your heart in the right condition, put away this type of speaking.
Amen.
Get rid of that froward mouth, that harsh speech, that hateful speech. Get away from it. And again, just on another side note, let me just say, if this is something that you deal with, you're always struggling with arguing with people, always contentious with people, or using language that is off-putting, let me just say, like, not as your pastor, just as an everyday person, it doesn't make you sound cool. It doesn't make you sound tough. You know what it makes you sound? It makes you sound unsaved. It makes you sound like the world that doesn't know better, that we're supposed to control our tongue and keep our hearts pure because that's where our speech comes from.
Yep. There you go. Amen.
If you want to call people names for any reason, really, you don't agree with something that they do, You don't agree with some lifestyle or some standard they have. You don't agree with something that they said. Just remember, you're going to give an account for every idle word
Yes.
that you say.
Right.
The comments you make behind your coworker's back, you're going to give an account for them. The names that you call those politicians that you don't agree with, you're going to give an account for them. You might say some rash or some rude things that make other people laugh while you're here on earth, but when you stand before God, make no question about it, He's not going to be amused by it.
Right.
Someone says, put that type of speech away from you. Then he goes on and says, perverse lips, put far from me. And when we hear that word perverse, our thoughts tend to go towards the word perverted related to fornication. But the word here really relates to words that are troublesome or contrary. And Solomon says this type of speech, it might be accepted in the world. It might be popular to speak this way in society, but it's wicked. And you need to put it far away from you. What would be an example of this? Using words that are close to cussing. Now, hopefully, we're here in Christians, we're in church, hopefully we're not cussing when we're out in public. But you know what we do? We use words that sound really close so people know what we mean. You know what Solomon says? Put it away. He didn't say it's okay. He didn't say as long as you're not using the actual word, that's all right. He says get rid of it. It's a condition of your heart. It needs to change. Now, froward mouths and perverse lips can apply to many different contexts. We've already said there's some people that just might need to change these things in their own lives. But maybe you don't have an issue when it comes to these things. But maybe you're friends with people who do speak in ways that aren't pleasing to God. So what do you do? What does Solomon say? Get away from those people.
Yep. Amen.
Get away. Put them away. If you're using this type of language, put it away from you. And if you're around people who use that type of language, put them away from you. Distance yourself from this type of speech. And verse 25 gives us another step. It says, let thine eyes look right on, and let thine eyelids look straight before thee. Once again, we see the idea here of keeping our eyes focused on where they should be.
Yes. Amen.
Not allowing them to drift towards things that are not pleasing to God. In Psalm chapter 101, verse 3, David said, I will set no wicked thing before mine eyes. And now, why does that matter? Because if you remember, David is a man after God's own heart. The things that you allow into your sight will affect your heart. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 51 says, mine eye hath affected mine heart. The things that we allow to pass before our eyes visually affect our spirit. And they cause a response to take place in our heart. The things that you see, the things that you watch, the things that you give visual attention to, they will affect your heart. Remember that song you used to sing when you were a little kid? Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. Why? Because there's a Father up above. And He's looking down. Make sure you know, He's looking down. And He's looking down in love, just like Solomon tells us here. I love you. I want what's best for you.
Yeah.
Be aware of this.
Right.
But if we think about that for a minute, that song, do you really believe that God is aware of what you're watching? Do you think God's aware of what you're seeing? Because if that's true, and it is, that means that there are some things that if I want my heart to be right with God, I shouldn't watch them.
Right.
You know what that means? If I want my heart to be right with God, that means there are some movies I can't watch.
Yes. Amen.
If I want my heart to be right with God, there are some TV shows I can't watch. If I want my heart to be right with God, there are some video games I can't play. If I want my heart to be right with God, there are some websites I can't go to. Why? Because I want to keep my heart right with God. Remember, these words that Solomon says, they're not meant to be restrictive. He's not trying to be a tyrant or a dictator. He says, my son, my daughter, my child, this person that I love as much as humanly possible. I want what's best for you. I want you to grow. I don't want you to get hurt. I don't want you to fall in some situation where your heart is no longer right with God. So protect your heart. Pay attention to the words and the sights that you subject your heart to. Then verse 26 says this, ponder the steps of thy feet. What does that mean? Very simply, think about where you're going.
Yep. Amen. Amen.
Think very seriously about the decisions that you're making and consider where they are going to lead you. Don't just start walking down a path with no specific purpose. Have a plan for your life that you've prayed about, that you've examined, that you've evaluated. Is this the direction that God wants me to go? Think about that. Ponder that before you start walking in that direction.
Amen. Amen.
And when we do those things, we see the positive assurance. The end of verse 26 says, let all thy ways be established. Verse 27 begins with, turn not to the right hand, nor to the left. Remove thy foot from evil. Psalm chapter 37, verse 3 says, the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9, just a few pages over, it says, a man deviseth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps. What does that mean? Very simply, if you're saved, your steps have been established. Your ways have been established. And when your ways are established, when God orders your steps, when He directs your steps, don't turn away from the path that God has set you on. It says here, turn not to the right hand, nor to the left. In other words, when your heart is right with God, stay there. If you're in church the way you should be, stay in church. If you're in the Bible the way you should be, stay in the Bible. If you're praying to God the way you should, stay in prayer. If you're meditating on God's Word, stay there. Don't get off the track. Stay there. Stay on track. And I know that these things might be difficult to change. In order to get your heart right with God, you might have to change some things in your life. You might have to change some of the ways that we speak. You might have to change some of the things that you see. You might have to put more effort into being intentional regarding the decisions related to the path that you're on, your job or your relationships, your spiritual walk. But the good news is that there's a reward for you when you do those things. Now, I understand there are people here who may need to change their hearts. There's some people here, and I don't know what anybody's going through, but there's no doubt that in the room this size, there are people here who probably need to change some attitudes. There are probably some people here who recognize that they need to change their speech. Might be some people here who need to realize that they need to change what they focus on, or the direction that they're going. And there's some people here today that might know those things and say, yes, I know I need to change this direction that I'm on. This path that I'm headed isn't the right way. I know I shouldn't be speaking this way, or I shouldn't be around these people who do speak this way because it affects my heart. But there's some people here that make no mistake about it, they're going to hit the doors and they're not going to change a thing.
Yep, that's right. Yep.
You know what's going to happen? Their hearts will say exactly where they are right now, which one I know where it is. Farther from God than what they really want to admit.
Yep.
Why? Because they're not willing to change. They're not willing to take those steps to a better spirit.
That's right, yes.
But regardless of what anybody else does today, you can change.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what you've done in the past. It doesn't matter if this message hit home with anybody else. If the Holy Spirit spoke to you today, you can change.
Amen.
And guess what? You can leave here today with your heart closer to God
Yes.
than it was before you
That's
came
right.
this morning.
Amen.
Verse 26 says, let all thy ways be established. In James chapter 5, verse 8, it says, establish your hearts. Your attitudes can change. Your speech can change. What you focus on can change. Your ways can be established when we incline not only your ears, but your heart to Solomon's advice. We draw closer to God. If I could have Brother Bud and Miss Janet come forward now as we prepare.